So I heard about this story from a friend who works at the airport, and I had no idea that there was a weather observation program at the airport, and I found out that a lot of people didn't know about that program either. And so when I heard that the FAA was looking to end this program, and they had scheduled a meeting here in Wichita, and they weren't going to allow the public or the media to attend, I thought it was something that people needed to know about. The FAA wanted to end the contract weather observers at the airport from doing the daily current conditions of the weather and have the air traffic controllers take on those duties. And a lot of people here were really concerned that they wouldn't be able to get accurate weather data by making that switch. It was important to really let people know what was happening, and whether or not the FAA was going to do that plan or not, they needed to know what was at stake. When I first heard about the situation, it took about 2 months from that first tip to when my first story actually aired. And part of the reason was I had to track down a lot of the information, and the contract weather observers here locally had to get clearance to actually be able to talk to me. They didn't want to jeopardize their work because they do have a contract with a federal agency. They were a little nervous about going on the record about this when their contracts were pending, and the fact that they worked closely with the FAA was an issue. So it took 2 months to get that worked out to my first story. Once the first story aired, I continued to follow the situation and this story for about 6 months, and I think I did a total of 9 stories overall. The hardest part was trying to get the FAA to acknowledge what was happening. They would issue written statements, but they would not go on the record with an audio interview in any form. They would not let me attend their private meeting with the local stakeholders when they held it. And so it was really hard to get that side of the story. I was not able to track down anyone here locally that was in favor of the switch. The government prevented the air traffic controllers from talking to me, so I was never able to get a sense from that side of what the change meant in their eyes. The other part was that I spent a lot of time, probably extensive amount of time, researching documents. I had to look into budgets for the transportation department, which includes the FAA. I had to look into previous documents that explained the work procedures for contract weather observers, and then at the airports and whose responsibility is whose, and kind of define how they work so that you knew what role they played in weather reporting. And it's all clearly defined, but it's buried in a lot of different documents. I ended up talking to our congressional delegation, Senator Jerry Moran and former Representative Mike Pompeo. They were brought into the story because the local people here felt like their concerns were not being heard, and they were appealing to our congressional delegation to help do something to stop the FAA from making this switch. In the end, Senator Moran and former Representative Pompeo were able to use the hearings going on in Washington last summer to prevent the FAA from making this change. So they did follow up with action once they knew the situation that was here, and after receiving letters from our local civic leaders about their concerns and why this was not a good idea. I do feel like it made a difference, because when the legislation was signed and it kept the FAA from making the switch, I do feel like the voices here that were just trying to keep the public safe were finally heard, and at least now the FAA is required to do a quite thorough safety review before they can make any switch. And so in that regard, my stories, I feel like, did have an impact, because it happened that what happens now was what the people wanted all along, you know, just to have their voices taken seriously, their concerns taken seriously.